Hey guys, how's it going? It's Luke here. So today I'm very excited to share with you an interview with Matt from Matt vs Japan. If you don't know Matt, he has a YouTube channel and he talks a lot about learning Japanese and learning languages to a very high level. I also recorded a video on Matt's channel, so I'll leave a link to that as well as a channel and his website in the description below. So yeah, hope you guys enjoy. Hey guys, how's it going? It's Luke here. So I'm very excited for today's video. I'm here with Matt from Matt vs Japan, and if you're not familiar with Matt, he followed originally the AJATT methods, all Japanese all the time, and since then he's branched off into his own YouTube channel. He's got his own methods, MIA, Mass Immersion Approach, and he's putting out a lot of really useful content for learners, not just about the method, like how to actually get hold of resources as well. I found this video figuring out how to download subtitles of Netflix, so he's got a bunch of cool stuff like that over there, so you should definitely go check it out. So Matt, how'd you manage that?
Yeah, hajime Thanks for having me on. It's really great to get to talk to you.
Yeah, so do you want to give a brief introduction about yourself and AJATT or MIA?
Sure. So I learned Japanese with the AJATT method, which was created over 10 years ago now by this guy named Katsumoto, which basically was just the policy of total immersion. Listen to the language, read the language, like interact with the language as much as humanly possible. You don't have to be in the country. You can use the internet. You can use technology to bring the language to your own little world, and then combine that with using the SRS and monolingual dictionary to reach a really high level of comprehension in the language, and not really worry about speaking at first. Just really focus on understanding and getting input. And then once you learn how to understand, then speaking will start to come to you naturally. And through putting off learning how to speak, then you avoid making bad habits and can end up with a really high level of proficiency in the end. And I used the AJATT method to learn Japanese. It worked really well for me. But as I continued to pursue a near native level in the language, I realized that there were still a lot of things that the original AJATT method didn't really cover, and even some things that I kind of disagreed with. And so I decided to kind of branch off and start doing my own thing, just so that I wouldn't be tied down to the AJATT name. But I definitely am still all for AJATT and a big fan of AJATT and owe everything to AJATT. So don't want it to sound like I'm a new sect that's like fighting against it or anything.
No, I mean, I completely agree. Like, I took a lot of stuff from the AJATT website, but I've also took from other places. If I had to sum up, I'd say my method's probably a mashup between Steve Kaufman, Ollie Richards, and AJATT. So I'm a big fan of AJATT as well, and he's definitely helped me a lot in the past. So yeah, that's really cool. So quickly then, you said Immersion and Anki. So is immersion the main driver, and Anki is kind of like a crutch to understand your immersion then, or how would you describe that relationship?
Definitely. Like, I would say that, of course, immersion is always the core. And one way to think about it is that you can learn a language just through immersion, but you can't learn a language just through Anki. If you're just doing Anki and you're not really getting off immersion, then you're filling your head with knowledge about the language, but that knowledge isn't really going to come to life and actually help you or be useful to you until you combine that with hundreds and thousands of hours of actually listening to the language. So I would say, yeah, by using the SRS, by using Anki, then you can really expedite the process of learning to understand the language, but that's only when combined with huge amounts of immersion.
Sure. So following this sort of approach then, how long would you say it took to get fluent? Whatever that means. Okay. I'm going to try and remember that. How long do you reckon it would take before you were understanding, say, 90% of your average TV drama in Japanese?
I mean, yeah. The thing is that, I mean, I hate to add so many qualifiers and stuff, but the thing with learning a language is that 90%, in a way, isn't really that much, because if you understand 90%, then that still means that like every couple sentences there was something that you missed, which really could mean that you can't follow the plot of a certain TV show because the one word you miss in a certain sentence might be really crucial to the plot. Like if you said, like, oh my god, that guy just blinked. What? Are you serious? Okay, what are we gonna do? It's like, I mean, sometimes missing a single word can really inhibit your comprehension of what's going on. And so I'd say within 1 year you can reach 90%, but that 90% might not be as great as you're imagining before you get there.
Yeah, this is me wording it badly. So I meant kind of not in terms of word count, but maybe like overall meaning and understanding and following the plot. So like not necessarily 90% word count, but like I understand 90% of things that are happening. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that after, and it also depends what language you're talking about. I'm assuming that we're talking about like learning Japanese
yeah, no,
and
I'm talking
coming
about your
from,
experience with
yeah,
Japanese.
yeah, yeah. So for me, like after a year, I could understand a lot of like I could completely follow a lot of basic stuff, but there was also a lot of more complicated stuff that I couldn't follow. Like I couldn't watch a lecture about science and follow it at all, or even sometimes like news articles and stuff would throw me off. But if I was watching a TV show that wasn't fantasy, like a realistic fiction TV show, then that was actually pretty easy. So
Yeah, yeah. I found actually like romance sort of dramas are normally pretty good ones to start with because like the like romance slash comedy sort of things are normally quite a nice start. And that like the ones I started watching first were like it was Hong Kong, so it was like kung fu and like romance. They're like the ones to start off with. I think it's pretty cool. So yeah, so I mean SRS is a pretty big part of the process then. So you use Anki. When I was learning Cantonese before, I think we spoke about this already, but I used HiSig. I discovered AJATT quite timely halfway through the HiSig book. And then yeah, I started sentence mining, and I got to about 1,000 sentences. At which point I got completely sick of it. I hated every second of it. I was like, fuck this, fuck. Yeah, I can swear. Fuck this, fuck AJAT, fuck SRS, fuck Anki. I just want to read and just try and enjoy it a bit more. So it got to the point when I was say I'd had 2 hours every night carved out for language learning. So I had my hour dedicated in the morning, but then like general reading and cards and stuff, I'd have like 2 hours at the night. And I'd spend probably an hour and a half out of that 2 hours making flashcards. The other times, doing like 200 plus reps a day, just creeping up and up, and then very little time actually reading. So like I found, for me at least, and maybe this is because of my bigger time restraints, because of my job and all that, or maybe because it was a lack of resources in Cantonese that you couldn't make cards as easy. But like I just got so sick of it. So when I took that jump to read more, like I was having more fun, and I think because I was having more fun, my brain was like actually more engaged, and like I'm much more likely to pick something up from having fun. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of like fun versus efficiency and that trade-off. Yeah.
Well, what's coming to my mind first is kind of how necessary is the SRS? What's the role of the SRS? Because you kind of just brought up how you dropped the SRS pretty early into the process and still made amazing progress, and it didn't really seem to have any downsides for you. And so my kind of thoughts on this is that the role of the SRS towards the beginning of the process is completely different than the role of the SRS when you're more advanced. And when you're a beginner, the SRS, kind of like I said a few minutes ago, is like the role is just to help you understand the language. And of course, the only way you're going to get a really comprehensive and intuitive understanding of the language is through lots of immersion. So it's not even really trying to give you crystal clear understandings of what words mean or how words are used. It's really just trying to help you create these, as I like to call them, dictionary entries in your head, so that your brain knows, like, hey, this is a word, it exists, it kind of sounds like this, it kind of means this, and then it's more likely that you notice it in your immersion, just like how when you're thinking about buying a car, you suddenly start noticing that car everywhere in your immersion. In your immersion in life itself. You start noticing it whenever you're on the road. So it's kind of like the process of going through these cards on Anki, it just kind of primes your brain to notice them in your immersion. But like I said, the action's happening in your immersion. But then later on, and this is completely optional, but once you're at a pretty high level, like you already are fluent and you can understand everything, what you may want to use the SRS for is for really trying to catch up your knowledge to native speakers in terms of both culture and language. Because native speakers, if let's say that you have a 20-year-old native speaker, they've spent their entire life using this language all day, every day, and they know tons of super obscure words, like the names of flowers, the names of dinosaurs, the names of obscure dishes, like all the different positions in baseball, all the different pieces of chess and what they're called. And so if you want to really catch up to native speakers, I do think that the SRS is a really good way to do that, and it might be quite difficult to do that otherwise, because it actually took native speakers 20 years to get there. And so if you want to achieve that same thing in a much reduced amount of time, then you might use that. On the other hand, a lot of people won't be interested in that, because even if you don't know the names of chess pieces, even though technically your knowledge is less than a native, that might not practically inhibit you. And so anyway, to like take a step back, I think that if it's interesting to talk about the using the SRS in that second way as you're more advanced, but that also is completely different than talking about using the SRS as a beginner. And I think that when we're talking about using the SRS as a beginner, it is definitely not crucial. It's more like it might be more of a learning style thing. Like for you, in the context of Cantonese, especially because in Cantonese there wasn't as many resources, using the SRS was really annoying and it came with a lot of work. And you noticed that it wasn't like the trade-off of all that work wasn't really worth it. You could get the same things just for reading. Whereas maybe for other people, they like the security of having their knowledge in the SRS. They know, like, as long as I keep doing my reps, then I won't backslide. And it actually makes their learning less stressful. So I think there might be a component of just learning styles.
Yeah, maybe like personality, because I was more worried about like finishing my daily quota than actually learning the stuff in there. So a quick point where I was at the end of the SRS then. So like, I'd say like you said you got 90% of comprehension pretty quickly. So I'd say in terms of word count, when I was reading and that, by the time I got to about, it was 1,000 sentences when I quit, I could understand, like I knew like 80% of the words and like most things, but I didn't, obviously knowing 80% of the words doesn't mean you necessarily have a single idea of what's going on, because like the devil's in the detail, so to speak. And that's definitely true with language as well. So like, even though I could understand 80% of the characters, Chinese characters, then I didn't know 80% of what was going on. So that's the position I was in when I started reading. And I think another thing is to point out is that I wasn't just like purely extensive reading. So I started off reading, it was a thriller book. It was like a horror thriller sort of book. The English name would translate to, if you want to survive, you have to kill yourself first.
Sounds like it could be an anime.
Yeah, probably. It's pretty animated. A lot of people coming back from the future and sort of weird shit. But what I liked about the thriller is the chapters were like super, super short. So like compared to like everyday life sort of thing, or like a novel, like the chapters are super, super long. But like even me with my slow reading pace, I could get through a chapter in maybe like 20 minutes. Took my native friends like 4 minutes. That's fine. So I actually read the chapter like twice in the morning before work and once that same chapter after work. So I was kind of getting that repetition in a different way. And then when I kind of progressed through the book, I think what I particularly like about a book over articles and over other mediums that are shorter is that because you get a lot of repetition, the author has a certain writing style, they use particularly connecting words. Maybe the main character has his favorite food, all of these things. So like over the course of like a whole book, you get repetition built into the process organically, and obviously that's how you learn our native language. As far as it's not as secure, but then if you kind of adopt the mindset of, if I'm reading 2 hours a day and immersing myself in TV, if a word doesn't come up again, then do I need to know it? Then maybe not. So for me, that trade-off of making it more fun, and I was saying before, like maybe it's not as efficient as AJATT, so maybe it takes me half a year longer to get to my goal. But the fact that I enjoy it a lot more, and like if it's something that I hate doing, I will resist with like I would just resist so hard. I'm just like, I'm not doing this, and like put up like a wall, and then. So I think more and more with language learning, at least in general for me, the only thing that is going to stop you is if you actually stop.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that you don't hear very many people like, I've been doing AJATT for a year, I've gotten 5,000 hours of immersion, and I still suck. What you hear is, I tried to do AJATT back in 2014, but I stopped after 2 months, and then I tried it again in 2015, and then I stopped after 1 month, but I'm going to do it this time, So...
Yeah, no, totally. So, like... the main thing is just, like, staying on the horse. It's like, yeah.
But the other thing is that you said maybe it would take me longer because it's less efficient. But like I said, I think, especially in the beginning stages, what's going to determine the speed of progress more than anything is how much immersion you're getting and what quality that immersion is. And especially, I think more and more that, especially as a beginner, when you're trying to listen to the language, like trying to watch a TV show in the language, it's very easy to just zone out and think about other stuff and basically not listen.
I'm guilty of that.
We're all guilty of that for sure. But I think that, of course, someone who's just zoning out while their L2 happens to be in front of them is going to be absorbing less and improving less than someone who's very attentive, trying to hear the sounds. And I really think the act of trying to understand it really controls this, like the speed of your progress, because you get better from failing things, right? It's like you try to do a task, like let's say you're trying to learn how to ride a bike or whatever, right? It's like you try to ride the bike, you fall over, then you try again, and you get better and better. And so by trying to understand and then not understanding, then you've now failed, and now you're getting into like kind of a feedback loop where you can try again. And I think it's really engaging that kind of trial and error improvement feedback loop in your brain.
Each time feeling like a bit better and better each time.
Yeah, and so you have to like try. I'm gonna understand the sentence. Oh, I failed. I'm gonna try to understand this sentence, and like actually trying to do that in your mind. It's like it might feel fruitless in the beginning, and it might feel like a total waste of time. But I really think that it's through that act that really gets your brain on board with trying to figure this language out, and because it really sends your kind of unconscious mind the message like this is important.
And then I think to add on top of what you just said, if you kind of just zone that in the background and you're not really paying attention, you're probably going to get bored very quickly, first of all. And the other thing is that I remember the first time I was watching, it's called Sing Zai Ying Hong, which is, it's I think the English name is A Fist Within Four Walls. So it's a Hong Kong drama about like kung fu and stuff in the Kowloon city, like in the sealed off city there, and it's like loads filled with like tries and all that stuff. The show is brilliant, but like I was watching it for like mostly for the fighting and stuff like that, because I was just watching them kick and punch each other. But I remember, like, apart from like the odd stuff like sorry, thank you, please, hi, my name's, I didn't really understand much. And then I remember when I understood my first sentence, and I was like, holy shit, I understood that whole sentence. That's amazing. Like, and you wouldn't get that if you weren't paying attention. You just kind of, you know, and when you get that, like, it's only a very tiny glimpse what it's like to understand. You're like, shit, I just gotta keep going now and just double down. And just do more.
It tells you, oh, it's possible. I can actually comprehend meaning in the language. And it sounds trivial, but that definitely subjectively is a huge experience. But anyway, just to tie, I want to talk more about this because this is really fun. But just to tie it back to what I was saying a second ago, that I kind of like went too broad. But it's basically that I think improvement in the beginning has to do with how much you're engaging, how much immersion you're getting, and how much you're engaging with that immersion. And I do think that having some kind of active, intentional learning on the side speeds up the whole process. But whether that's the SRS or you just sitting with a book and looking everything up or reading the same thing multiple times, giving it your full undivided attention, I don't think that would really affect the process. But I do think that your process of reading very intensively, that might actually be worse than SRSing for a lot of people in terms of enjoyment. And so I definitely think that there's going to be different learning styles in a way, person to person. I mean, you got to be careful here because in a way, all humans acquire language the same, as Stephen Krashen said. You know, just like how all humans digest food the same. But even that, what that's really saying is that the fundamental mechanism of acquiring language is the same, which is through understanding messages in the language. You know,
well, that's so broad.
Yeah, but how you get to the point of understanding messages in the language, like the specific techniques you use, might look different from person to person. And so it could be that whether you're using Anki or whether you're sitting and looking stuff up in the book, it's like fundamentally you're still just telling your brain that all these words exist and exposing yourself to all these words, and then you're going and getting immersion so that you can really consolidate all that stuff. It is the same, although it's different on the surface.
So on that topic, I watched, when I was first learning Cantonese, I watched a few sort of YouTube polyglot type people, and one of them I watched was Luca Lamparello, the Italian guy. He speaks really good English. I don't know about other languages because I don't speak them, but he just said he does a technique called bidirectional translation, when he takes it from Italian, translates it into his target language, and then translates it back to Italian again. And I'm sure that's like a really great way to like help you notice all the structures, like really give your brain a good workout and do all that stuff. But like, it just looks like so much effort. I just can't be bothered to bring myself to do it. So like, I'm sure it's great, but if I don't do it, it doesn't account for anything.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's such a language nerd. It's probably total joy for him, huh?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But the reason that I like my technique, and I guess this will be a good segue into my next topic I wanted to talk about, which was the use of beginners tools. But like, because in general, like, if I pick the right resource, then the beginners content can be quite interesting. So like, when I was learning Spanish, I'm still learning now. I've got a long ways to go, but I finished my beginner's course called. It translates to A Man in a Hat. So it's a story split into 20 chapters, filled with cognate short chapters, decent size. So like, follows these friends traveling around Spain as they go to different places and all that stuff, and like it's like there's a bit of a mystery around it, and they're going traveling around, and the story is actually quite interesting. And I'm learning more about Spain as a country. So like, when my friend was said, like they went to somewhere in the book called the Basque Country, and I was like, well, I've never heard of that before. I probably should have. So sorry if you're from Spain. But then my friend later was like, oh yeah, I'm from the Basque Country. I'm like, shit, I was in the story. I know that. So that kind of real element gives it quite a nice touch. But going a bit onto that, I'm doing the same method with more authentic resources. So like, one thing I'd like to do is import YouTube videos from Link, people talking maybe 2-3 minutes long with like the subtitles, use that as a transcript. So in a relatively early stage on, if you get a lot of repetition with that one video, you can get to the point where you can understand 100% of that one YouTube video, and it kind of like gives you a glimpse, like you said before. This is possible. I can learn. I can understand everything in this video. Therefore, there's no reason why I can't understand everything in this movie. I just need to keep going, you know. And there's that sort of like glimpse of actually being able to do it that can like spur you on a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've never used that technique personally, but I've heard a lot of people talk about those kind of techniques where you're using one really limited kind of immersion source or like source of the language very intensively, repeated many times over. And I think, like, for some people that will probably be super boring. But if you, but then the benefit again is that, yeah, like you said, you can get that glimpse and understanding. And I also think there's probably a lot of benefits pronunciation-wise from listening to the same thing over and over and over. Because when you first start learning a foreign language, there'll probably be some sounds in the language that you can't actually perceive yet because your brain's like it just trained itself to ignore all those sounds that weren't relevant. And I've heard that listening to one thing over and over and over hundreds of times can be a method to open up your ears to those sounds again. And I think there might be that benefit as well. I actually heard about that when I was first learning Japanese, and I tried to do it. Because I heard of this Chinese guy named Jerry Dai, I think his name was. And he started learning English when he was 21, when he moved to Canada. And now he sounds very close to a native speaker. He actually sounds like a native speaker, just a little bit weird. Like if I met him, I thought he would just be a little bit of a weird native speaker. And I heard that his method was, and I actually didn't hear it from him. I actually heard this from a Steve Kaufman video where Steve Kaufman was talking about Jerry Dai. He said that Jerry Dai listened to the same half-hour-long English clip hundreds and thousands of times. And I thought, that's genius. I'm going to do this. And I got the clip and I listened to it for a few weeks, and then I think I just got so bored I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, so I'm not quite that intensive. So like, I listen to the same thing many times over on like say day one, pick chapter 1 from the book and listen to that dialogue over and over when I'm walking about. So when I got to the end of the day, well, in Spanish, Link tracks the amount of times you listen to something. I listened to that chapter about 80 times across the course of the day. On day 2, I go do the same thing with chapter 2 and then just kind of ignore chapter 1 and go on to the next thing. But also the other thing is, like, that is like the intensive bit. So I still was immersing. So it's kind of like, I think it's like what you said before, you know, with Anki, you've got that intensive, more focused study, and then if you pair that with immersion, then everything I was just learning in this little intensive bit over here, because there's such common words, I was then listening to a TV show that night. I'm like, oh shit, I know that word, like cool, and like you get a bit more every time. So I think I would have forgot a lot more and maybe needed SRS if I wasn't immersing, but I was, so it kind of sticks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that is a really good balance. And I kind of have talked about a similar thing on my channel where you actively immerse with media in the language every day, and then after you watch something, you put it into a folder, and at the end of the week, you take all the videos in the folder and just turn that into MP3 audio that you put on your iPod or whatever, if anyone still has an iPod, and then you listen to that the next week. So every week you're watching new stuff actively, and then you're listening passively to the stuff from the last week. And that also is a way to get the right balance of repetition and freshness, basically, I think. Because I think that is important, because clearly repetition is very beneficial, but it can also be very boring. And so I think, like, similar to your method, it's a good idea to try to find the right balance.
Yeah, because, like I said, I did try to do it more than that in the past, and I just kind of get bored. And people say, "Oh, you need to review and all that stuff," and I'm just like, I'm not really motivated to go over the same bit of content again. Like I know I probably should review, but at the same time, I really don't want to. So that I think when I was reviewing, when I got through like the first 10 chapters, I literally, in the space of about half an hour, literally just read through once from chapter 1 to chapter 10. Like that was my review, and I couldn't want to do any more than that. You know. But I've heard that as well. As Manfred Spitzer, a neuroscientist, says for the brain to learn, you need repetition, and you also need novelty. And it's when you have both that really helps. So, like for me, flashcards weren't very novel. Whereas reading a book, when you get the repetition over a longer period of time with an interesting story, then it's a bit of the novelty. But I guess if you're first starting, you can't understand a book, so it's kind of like how do you get to the point when you can understand most of a book and just use something like Link or an online dictionary and just read loads? And it's getting to that point's the hard bit. So for me, and if there's any AJATTers watching this, they might not like this, but I like to use beginners resources. So I'm just going to say Genki because I don't actually know any Japanese textbooks. That's the only one I've actually heard of. So something like Genki, when I first started, I don't know if that's an actually good one or not. I'm sure you can tell me. But something like that filled with
I'm not a fan, but I think when you say beginner resources, I would make a distinction between grammar, like textbooks resources that are just explaining you grammatical formulas, with basically immersion sources that are made for learners or made for beginners that are mostly just dialogues or videos with simplified slow language.
Okay, yes. So the book I used for Cantonese was Teach Yourself Complete Cantonese. So it was split into 25 chapters, each chapter with 2 dialogues about 30 seconds long. They did have some grammar notes in there, but there were maybe 1 or 2 sentences. So I'd just read it once and then spend the lion's share of the time on the actual listening and reading to the dialogues. And I think this is really powerful because, like I said, you can get up to a bit where you can understand a lot of what you listen to really early on, which has knock-on effects. But I think, as most stuff, there's a caveat to attach, and I think the main one with this is that if you get comfortable in your little language learning material bubble, I don't know what to call it. If you only immerse with Teach Yourself and Asimil and that sort of stuff, and you get really comfortable in that, then everything outside that bubble seems really intimidating and daunting, and then you can just never want to leave. You want to stay in your little cozy kind of language learning material shell.
Yeah.
You never want to actually leave outside.
I think that's the biggest danger. Yeah, I think that's a really good point because I think that's one of the strengths of AJATT is that it's really just throwing you out into the real world from the beginning. It's saying, screw all those beginner materials, just go watch, whatever you... One of the things that Katsumoto said that I really like is whatever you're learning the language in order to be able to do and understand, just do that from the beginning. It's if you're learning the language because you want to watch Kung Fu movies in the original language to understand them, just watch Kung Fu movies from day one, And so, and there is that advantage, but I think now the more that kind of I talk to people like you and I really look at other people, it makes me really realize that the real magic in the AJATT method is the immersion and what you do for the other active component to kind of catalyze your progress of understanding through immersion doesn't really matter that much. And so, working with beginner materials, I can see that as long as you don't become too reliant on them and you're combining them with immersion, ideally from the beginning, then I can see it being a really effective thing, even though probably me from a year ago would be surprised that I'd be saying that. But I mean, clear. It's you look at polyglots who do make really fast progress through the beginner stages. I mean, one of my biggest criticisms of a lot of polyglots is that they just reach a really mediocre level in a language and move on to the next one instead of actually reaching a high level of fluency. But even so, you can't deny that they're really good at blowing through the beginner stages. And so clearly,
that's because they've practiced it so many times.
Yeah, but you see a lot of polyglots talking about doing similar things like intensive work with one of the Teach Yourself series or something like that. And I think it's basically doing the same thing as the SRS. It's just telling you that these things exist, priming your brain to notice them. And
what I really like about the AJATT method, and probably a lot of the reason why I kind of strayed from it is because I couldn't apply this in Cantonese, but say if I wanted to understand anime, for an example, because I'm probably a lot of Japanese learners want to understand anime. then you can take sentences from the anime and make flashcards with them. So that your focused study time is directly complementing your immersion. Whereas for me, I couldn't take that because the subtitles in Cantonese were different to what was being said, like the spoken written divide of the language. So I couldn't actually do that. But I can see if I was motivated by, let's just say, anime and manga and stuff, and I was taking sentences directly from that, I was mining them and then seeing them in the show that night, then that's like going to be super motivating. So I think that's like the real power in AJATT, that kind of complementing each other. And I didn't get that from sentence mining, which is probably why I didn't stick with it as long. You know?
Yeah, but I do think that's really important to have your immersion and your SRS study be as integrated as possible, or ideally whatever you're doing for that active component. The more integrated they are, then the more they're going to complement each other, and you might have a sort of a effect of what's the English word for that? I can only think of the Japanese word. Sojo koga. Yeah, like when each one helps the other one out.
Reinforce, but it doesn't have to be SRS as well. Like, so when I just took Spanish, for example, in the beginning I spent a lot of time playing Skyrim in the for my immersion because that was quite easy to do. And when I was, for a lot of time in my focus time, I was reading short stories for beginners about like dragons and knights and shit, and like it's like, oh, why do you want to learn that? Well, because it helps me understand Skyrim. That's why I want to read that. Like, it might not be useful to talk to dragons with my Spanish friend, but if it helps me understand my immersion, then who cares?
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Yeah, so that's why I use beginner's tools, and I think one thing I want to take quickly is the thing that helps me not kind of fall into that trap of staying with it too long is like one, immersion from the beginning, like you said, but the other thing was like setting goals. So for me, I'd be like, okay, month 1 I'm going to use beginners resources. Month 2 I'm going to use, I'd say in quotation marks, intermediate resources, because I'm not really intermediate. And then from month 3 I'm just going to pick a book or something more interesting and just use that, because that kind of stops the kind of puts it in a structure. Like, after this, regardless if we're ready or not, I'm just going to throw my ASML in the bin, you know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good idea. That's something that I think I would explore when learning another language, is setting those type of goals, because I never really did that in the beginning. I mean, Katsumoto talked a little bit about setting goals, but it was more like micro goals. Like, what are you going to do today? Like, set a goal for how much you're going to do today, rather than what you're going to do for this month. I mean, I'm not positive. Maybe he did talk about that, but I just ignored it because it wasn't interesting to me at the time. I don't want to make any definite statements about what he did and didn't say. But I think it does make a lot of sense, because I mean, I think especially for me when I was learning Japanese, I had this idea of fluency as a very concrete binary thing. Like, I don't think I ever thought this clearly about it, but my perception was almost like I was going to go to bed not fluent one day, and I was going to wake up the next day fluent, and that was going to be the line. It was, I could point to it like, yep, it was this moment at 12:01 p.m. that I became fluent in Japanese. And
didn't realize how wishy-washy it was. Like,
yeah, and then I would have beaten the game, and I could retire. And reality, it's, your language ability is always a spectrum, and whatever kind of line you draw in the sand is ultimately arbitrary. And so now I think if I was going to learn another language, it'd be really hard to try to work with that, like, fluency as a goal, because I would understand that I would never actually get there. I would never, it would be too nebulous. And so I think having more concrete goals that you can reach, like, within a month or two would definitely help motivation, help you move along and not get trapped in that, oh my god, it's going to be so long until I actually, like, master this language.
Yeah. And I think something that helps me, like, this is probably quite hard to do if you've not learned a language before, but, like, if you just look at someone else who has, or take someone else's advice, like, say, Matt's, who knows what he's talking about, then you can kind of, like, start building a vague picture in your head of kind of like a roadmap. Like, if I set if I set a goal a month, and I set these specific goals, and by the 7th month I could be reading, I don't know, if you're learning English, by the month 7 I could be reading the first book of Game of Thrones and understand most of it. And if I follow these steps, you can kind of line it out in your head. And
even if you don't get there, you'll probably still have made a lot of progress, and
sure,
we'll feel good about that.
Yeah, so in with respect to time, I'm going to probably move on to the next question, because it's hard not to ramble. So what's your thoughts on when to start speaking?
That's a hard one. I mean, I I think that you could start. I mean, in an ideal world, you would put it off probably about 2 years. I would say that might sound really crazy, but if
Is
you
that
really,
for a Asian language for an English native speaker?
yeah, I would say so. So maybe you could even cut that in half if it was you were learning a language that was part of the same language family as a language you already know.
It'd be like a third. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Based on like FSI-ish, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is that there's from a pure language learning perspective, when you don't take any practical concerns into account, there's pretty much no downside and only upsides of putting off learning to start speaking. Because even if you, I mean, the input hypothesis says that the more input that you get, the more your speaking ability is going to grow naturally. But even if you don't agree with that, or you don't believe that, and you throw that out the window, and you think about that learning how to speak is an isolated skill that's going to take this many hours of training, regardless of how much immersion you've gotten. Even if you think about it that way, if you have two people, one person who understands 50% of the language and another person who's gotten to the point where they understand 100% of the language, and at the time that they start learning how to speak, obviously the person who understands 100% of the language is at a huge advantage, because once you reach the point where you can understand everything, you have an intuition for what's correct and what's not correct. And also you can get feedback from native speakers more clearly about whether what you said was natural or not. You can look at their reaction and things like that. And so you're going to improve quicker and your results probably going to be better. And so that's why it's hard to put a date on when you should start speaking, because in a way it's like, well, if we were all, let's just say, immortal, right? We were all going to live 10,000 years and all we cared about was our language ability, then hey, why don't you just wait 100 years before you start learning how to speak? Because then you'll have so much input, you'll be in such a great position. You won't have any bad habits, you'll have perfect intuition, you can quickly build up your ability. Because I guess the downside of starting earlier is that you'll end up building bad habits and stuff. I should have said earlier. But when we're going to get more practical, then we have to start weighing the benefits of putting off immersion, because there's kind of diminishing returns for putting it off longer and longer, right? And I would say up to a year, you get it probably is worth trying to put off outputting, because before that, I mean, the benefits of trying to output are so low because you understand so little anyway that your conversations are just going to totally suck, and you're going to have no idea what you're doing, and you're probably going to build a lot of bad habits because you're just going to be thinking in your native language, using formulas to translate that. It's going to be unnatural and weird, and you're not really going to make any progress anyway.
Okay, so to kind of word stuff and kind of throw it back in your face a little bit. So if on the AJATT website it says whatever the thing is you want to do the most, you should just start with that thing. And the thing you want to do the most is speak to people, then, you can see where I'm going.
Yeah, well, I think also, I mean, it comes down to what your goals are, because if you are really in this in the long run, and you have a vision for yourself in 10 years where you're basically a native speaker of that language, you can function just as well, you sound just as competent and just as fluent as native speakers, then you have to make some short-term sacrifices, which might be putting off learning how to speak. But most people don't have that goal, because it's a pretty outrageous goal. Most people who just want to be able to interact with natives in the language without there being any noticeable barrier, and want to be able to enjoy media in the language and understand the culture directly, and so on. And so if that is your goal, then it might not be worth it to you to be put off output that long. I mean, I would want to say that realistically, at least 6 months is probably going to be worth it for most people, unless you really just want to be able to have a survival kind of level. But.
So, I guess I'm going to come back with my thoughts, and I'm just going to say quickly first before I start rambling on, I do agree with everything you just said from an entirely intellectual point of view, But language learning is not necessarily purely intellectual. If anything, the biggest influencer is psychology, because doesn't matter what you do, if you do it for long enough, you're going to succeed, and if you stop, you won't. So if you take that into account, and you said the vision for a native speaker in 10 years' time. So when I first started learning Cantonese, I did not have a vision. I did not even want to become fluent. I didn't even really care. If I could say a word if I could say "How are you today" to my girlfriend in Cantonese, I'd be happy. I didn't really care that what the big end goal was. But then the thing is it's a moving goalpost. So if I was like, oh, I want to have a super simple conversation and then I'm happy. But when I reach that, then I want the next step, and then I want the next step, and then I want the next step. So it wasn't until I reached the early steps and realized kind of how limited it felt that I wanted the step after. So if I started off without outputting from the start and just kind of kept on delaying it for this day that may or may not come, then, you know, I don't think I would have got that far at all, because I just wasn't that into it. It was only by speaking and feeling it that I kind of got into it a bit more. So this is probably one of the most kind of vivid memories I've had like in my life, and this might sound a bit of over dramatic, but I remember I've been learning Cantonese for about 6 months, which is a very short time for learning an Asian language. And I had a conversation on my with my italki tutor on Skype, like me and you were having now, and we had a conversation for an hour with no English whatsoever, you know, just speaking Cantonese. I was paraphrasing, she was paraphrasing, she was typing words in the box, and I kind of thought through it. But at the end of that hour, like the amount of energy I just had like rushing into me, like shit, I can actually do this. Like this is like a real thing, and if I keep going, I will get there. I just have to like keep going, double down, keep going, and you will get there eventually. So it's this kind of this feeling of almost like euphoria and like shit, like I can actually do this, and this kind of like unparalleled sense of motivation that I would not have got if I wasn't speaking from the start. And I put down a lot of my success down to purely that drive and that motivation, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting to hear, because, I mean, ultimately, psychology has to trump efficiency, or that from that pure intellectual perspective, because it doesn't matter if you have the perfect language learning method if you don't do it, right? And so, clearly, if you know, when you're kind of saying, well, due to my specific circumstance, if I wasn't outputting, I probably wouldn't have continued, and I wouldn't have achieved what I achieved, then, of course, I can't say, oh yeah, but you might have fucked up your accent. So, it's like obviously
I have a fucking English accent. That's fine.
Yeah, so it's like clearly that sense that psychology does trump anything I have to say, and I would say I'm starting to notice more and more that's probably my biggest weakness as a language learning philosopher, or whatever you want to call what I do on YouTube, is that I lean too much to the theoretical what would be ideal if we were robots side, and kind of forget that we're not robots sometimes. But I would also say that, practically speaking, though, when I am talking about starting to output, I'm really thinking about making that a regular part of your routine, like multiple times a week you're speaking the language, or there's people in your life who you speak the language to that you see on a regular basis. And so, because you really have to be speaking the language regularly in order to make linguistic habits, and what you're really trying to avoid by putting off early output is bad linguistic habits. And so if you're talking about like once a month, or even once every 2 weeks, probably even once a week, you're talking to a tutor on italki, that's probably not enough for linguistic habits to seriously become an issue for you, especially if you're getting lots of immersion. And so maybe there could be kind of a balance where a few times a month you have a conversation with an italki teacher, and that can be really motivating for you, but you're still having a large majority of your time being just input.
Yeah, and so like I said, I have my like hour focused in the morning plus TV immersion, and then I think I had maybe like 2 italki sessions a week. So like, if you split it in terms of hours, then maybe that's like 10 hours of input versus like 2 hours of talking. And when I was a beginner, my italki sessions was like over half of it was listening, so then it kind of skews it even more in that way, because I don't know enough to say it yet. So like, it's always a big part. It was the main engine is always input. Even if I speak early or speak late, I think it depends on your goals and your timelines. But like, I think the engine should always be input. You know?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's it's definitely a hard question. And but I also think that even if you are doing early output, there's a lot of things you can do to reduce whatever negative effects that might have, especially just having an understanding that native speakers say things in the language in a certain way, and that way is set in stone, and if you don't say it the exact same way that a native says it, then you're going to sound unnatural, even if they understand what you're trying to say. Like, because a lot of people, that sounds very obvious if you've ever learned a language, but a lot of traditional language learners don't really have this understanding, and so they think that they can just think in their native language, translate it directly into the language, and if they're understood, then they kind of mentally go like, oh, okay, cool, that worked. I'll put that in my repertoire, use that again later. But if you have an understanding that if you haven't heard a native speaker say that exact phrase multiple times, then it should be suspicious whether that's natural or not. Like if you have this very skeptical attitude towards your output, then it's less likely you're going to make a bad habit, because just because you said something and it's understood, if you're still in your mind are like, okay, that she understood me, but I'm still not sure if this is natural, then and there's kind of like an alarm going off in your head of like, oh crap, I'm making up language now, I'm in the danger zone. Language isn't a creative activity. Then even though you're outputting and you're making mistakes, it's not very likely that those mistakes are going to become habits.
So a thing that I think can help with this as well is when I'm speaking, and I had a Spanish session earlier today, so I could copy and paste the list of statistics sent to me if you're interested. But basically, when I'm speaking, anytime I don't know how to say something, I'm like, como se dice blah 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 in Espanol. And then she'd type it down for me, and I'm like, cool. And therefore, by basically asking her, how do you say this? So like most of my output first is saying, how do you say X? How do you say Y? How do you say Z? And I get someone to tell me how do you say blah, blah, blah. And then that gives me a list of stuff I want to be able to say that a native speaker has told me how to say it, that I can make flashcards out of. So I think you can kind of, I wouldn't learn how to say, hi, my name's Matt and I'm a language YouTuber, from watching Japanese TV show. But with an italki session, you can get someone to write it down for you, and you can just, cool, that's a flashcard. So there's definitely always that element as well.
I mean, I think it definitely depends on your goals, because, like, I mean, if your goals are, I mean, I don't know how to put this. If your goals are very ambitious, and you do want to reach a very high level, then that whole, I can see using the italki as a purely motivational factor. But if you're really thinking like, I'm trying to build my listening skills through, or sorry, I'm trying to build my speaking skills through practice starting early on, I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because basically when you're a beginner in the language and you can't understand very well, you don't have an intuition for what is correct and what's not correct, in a way you're a blind person. And so if your goal is to, I've used this metaphor before, let's say your goal is to become a painter. If you're a blind person and you're trying to paint a landscape, you really have no shot in hell of painting anything that looks like a landscape or that is beautiful to anyone's perspective. And even if you have a native go and be like, or a native in this case is a sighted person.
An artist.
So, your mountain, you drew that mountain wrong. It's like, okay, well I can't even see the mountain that I drew, so what is that going to help me? And so really it's like, okay, so she told you how to say these things in the language and you can make a flashcard out of that, but that's still, in a way, in my mind, that kind of sounds like you're training output. It's like you're going to memorize a set phrase that you're going to say, and you're going to say it with that. But that's basically like a blind person trying to memorize a hand motion. When your goal should be to get to the point where you're sighted, you understand everything, you have an intuition, and you can naturally create language out of that intuition.
When I was learning Cantonese, like, you've got to bear in mind, if I tell you exactly what I did, it's kind of like, do what I say, not what I do. Because when I was learning Cantonese at the first, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I don't have a hell chance in knowing how to do it. I've never been through the process before. So if all I've seen is like people going, speak from day one, speak from day one. Oh look, this is this polyglot who speaks 20 languages saying speak from day one. This other guy's doing it. He looks like he's having a pretty good conversation after a month. God, this is the best thing to do. Let's just do that. And then by the time I was kind of already down that path, it was too late.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that is what I call the fluency illusion, where there's this pretty well-known effect called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is when you first start learning a new skill, you improve very quickly because you're starting from nothing. So every little bit you learn is a huge improvement, and your confidence shoots up. You're like, oh, I just learned the basics of this skill. I'm pretty good now, and you feel really good about yourself. But then you get a little bit better, and you suddenly see how deep this iceberg goes underwater, and you realize, oh crap, actually I suck compared to the masters, and your self-confidence shoots down, and it stays down for a very long time until you truly master the skill. And so basically I think that happens with people learning languages. When they first learn a language, they get to the point where they can have a basic conversation, and then they're like, oh, look at me, I'm so dope, when they don't really compare themselves to a native speaker and realize that they're basically the equivalent of like a 3 or a 4-year-old. But at the same time, what I call the fluency illusion is this Dunning-Kruger effect projected onto other people. because like I don't speak any Spanish, and so I could see you speaking to a native speaker in Spanish having a conversation, and it might look to me that you're extremely fluent because you're saying things that I don't understand, definitely doesn't sound like English, and the other person is understanding you, you're understanding them, and so there's just an illusion that you're completely fluent in the language, and it's hard to really remember that you have no idea whether they're sounding like complete garbage or not.
So, did you see my video I posted last Thursday, me speaking Spanish for the very first time on italki after 3 months of immersion?
I don't think so. I think I saw that you posted it. I don't think I will.
I don't
have any memory of it.
So, I'm just basically to add on top of what you said. So I spoke for half an hour. We communicated. We had a pleasant conversation. I am telling you, you don't have to understand Spanish. My Spanish is fucking dreadful. My grammar was
maybe
all
that
over
was
the
an
place.
exaggeration.
My pronunciation is like pretty bad. I had my friend message me today, Elaine. She was like, "Oh my god, your Spanish is so fluent." I'm just like, it's really not, and I'm fine to say this because like I'm not claiming to be fluent. It's only 3 months. Like to expect that I would be fluent is just absurd after 3 months. So I think this is probably a good kind of place to sum up. I just wanted to say that I guess 2 things. The first one is that if you're looking out to learn a language, find someone's method to copy whose goals are similar to what your goals are. Is number 1. And number 2, I think if you're learning a language to a high level, there's hundreds of methods out there, but every single one of them converges with immersion because you don't get good to a high level without immersion. So like, it doesn't matter what you do to get to the point when you can start understanding and enjoying it, but it all goes to the same place eventually if you are learning to a high level. So like, if all's said and done and you don't care that much about accent and sounding perfect and you just want to like get to a high level and immerse and enjoy it, then it really doesn't matter. Just do whatever you enjoy and just keep immersing and eventually you'll get there. So
yeah, I totally agree.
And then one last question for you then, Matt. I mean, I'm sure we can do this again some other time, but we've talked a lot about immersion, but immersion can really suck as a beginning when you have no idea what's going on. So for anyone watching this who's like, yeah, I'm psyched, I'm going to immerse in Japanese or Cantonese or Spanish or whatever, then what advice do you have for people to get immersion as a beginner that doesn't suck and you can actually like enjoy it?
Well, I would say it's all about calibrating your expectations, because although immersion in a way is sitting down and watching a TV show, it's a lot different than watching a TV show in a language that you're already fluent in. When you're fluent in a language, you're enjoying the story of whatever you're watching, the plot. When you're a beginner, you're not going to understand the plot. So if you try to enjoy it the same way that you enjoy something in your native language, you're just going to be constantly reminded of how little you understand, and you're going to have an awful time. Instead, you have to make it feel more like a game. You have to think about, like I've said before in a video, that it's really similar to playing World of Warcraft or Pokemon, where when you're playing Pokemon, you might go and just grind battling trainers and battling Pokemon in the wild to get your Pokemon up to a high enough level to beat the gym. And the act of doing that, in a way, isn't very fun. Like, when you're trying to get somewhere in Pokemon and it goes and you like go into a battle, you're not happy about that. You're pissed off. You wish it didn't happen, right? And when you battle a trainer and you see that they have 6 Pokemon, like, that you're gonna have to beat, it's like,
it's so long.
Yeah, it's like, but you still are choosing to play Pokemon, not even because it's going to benefit you, like, just for fun. And so you have to realize that the nature of fun might be a little bit different than you had in mind when you first started. And so if you take that mindset of grinding is fun in a way because it gets you to it gets you gains, basically, right? And you reformat it as, oh, right now, like, I'm in the grass training with Pokemon, I'm leveling up right now. If you really frame it as that, then it can feel a lot more fun. And also, it depends with what you're doing with your mind. Like, don't just sit there and zone out. You play games. Like, if you're a very beginner and you just learned, like, the pronunciation system, like, if you've learned all the sounds that exist in the language, see if you can notice all the sounds in your head. See if you can, like, if you know the writing system, try to imagine that you're trying to transcribe everything that's being said into the writing system. Say, am I hearing every vowel? Am I hearing every consonant? Which you're not going to at first. And then see how many you can hear. At the beginning, you're not even going to be able to tell where one word ends and another begins. So see if you can just notice that, right? Set little goals of what you're going to try to notice about the language, and then reward yourself internally when you notice those things. Like, be like, oh, hell yeah, I just heard that whole word, right? And then once you get a little bit better,
like,
yeah. And then
sentence, that's well on your way.
Yeah, yeah, and then you can start looking for all the words that you've learned, see how much you can notice. And so basically you have to learn how to play these games inside your head that are easy to win, because you're not going to win the overall goal of understanding everything for a long time. So I'd say it's all about your engagement with it. Don't just expect it to automatically be. And also it is in a bit of an acquired taste. So you have to keep that in mind, where you learn how to enjoy it. And I think that's one of the things why polyglots just keep learning languages and never stop, is because they've mastered the meta skill of enjoying the process of learning a language. And that is something that gets cultivated over time.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, people say to me all the time, like, oh, you know, why are you spending all this time? I'm like, but it's so much fun. Why are you not? You know? And then if I spoke to me 3 years ago, I'm like, oh, that's, you know, fucking ignore that. But, yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to add on a point of immersion is I like to do stuff that is fun, even if I can't understand. So if I take Spanish, for an example, boxing's huge in Mexico. If I watch a fight with Spanish commentary, a Mexican fight, like, say, Canelo Alvarez, I can watch him, like, dancing around the ring, punching and fighting this dude. If I just don't understand anything, it's still entertaining. And they're saying what I'm watching. So it's kind of like that sort of, you know, reinforcing each other. But yeah, man, thanks so much for doing the interview with me. I'm pretty psyched. And I think it was definitely insightful for me. I hope my
me
viewers
too.
enjoyed it that much. So
yeah, thanks for having me. It's awesome to talk about people who have, you know, done a little bit different methods, because then we can really get to the bottom of what matters, you know? What if we do the same? Because that's what's important.
So I think I've cracked language learning. Matt versus Japan 2019. Language learning is Pokemon.
Oh, hell yeah.
Cool. Cheers, Matt.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. Oh, look at me. I'm so dope.